You know, we're all 9 years older than when I was here last. But the conflict, as it's called, we'll talk about that issue, is still with us. And as Judy was saying, with a vengeance. So what I'd like to do tonight is get into the issues of not only of settler colonialism, that I think is an important concept, but the solutions. We get to think of a way out. You know, there has to be a political resolution, and we're not really thinking about it so much. So, as many of you know, I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAN, and but over the last few years, both myself and ICAN have been instrumental in starting a Palestinian-led organization called the One Democratic State Campaign. And you know, we're really saying that, you know, the two-state solution we'll see tonight, I don't want to talk about. It's gone, and it never was, and it's simply deflection if we even bring it up. But that we do need a political program. You know, it's not enough to resist, it's not enough to protest. To lobby as you do, all the good things that you're doing is really important, but it's not at the level of advocating for a political program. You know, in South Africa, there was always the end game, one person, one vote. So all of us of a certain age, which is most of us, you know, knew what we were boycotting, what we were demanding of our governments. One person, one vote. In Palestine, you don't have that yet. And so we're working, and so I want to talk about that, but I want to get into settler colonialism because the solution flows out of the analysis. But before I do that, now we have another high-tech issue here
You want to switch to,
in our world, so. This is the slide.
yeah,
Okay, so I'll, okay,
You put the whole thing up. So we can all see
what whole thing.
the screen, the projected screen there. Higher up on the wall.
Move it higher.
last time we tried to move it, we lost everything. That's something you can put.
Okay. All right. First things first. So, where we are today, before we get into this analysis, is that, you know, where are we at this particular political moment where we're sitting here? And you know, we talk about the Israel-Palestine thing. You know, we've been talking about it for years, and it goes on and on and on. But in fact, we're getting to a point where it ends. And not in a good way. So where we are exactly today, you know, we have to talk about Gaza, or at least we have to think about Gaza. Our hearts are all with Gaza, and you can't really begin a discussion without acknowledging the genocide that's going on in Gaza. Having said that, and appropriately our attention is focused on that, but having said that, Gaza is a marginal, minimal piece of the bigger geopolitical picture that's going on. There's something much bigger. And if I give another title for this talk, it might be something like, you know, Israel is nailing down apartheid under the cover of genocide. Because as we're all focused on the genocide in Gaza, all kinds of things are happening in the West Bank and in the wider Arab world and in the United States and Canada and so on, that are more important from the point of view of what exactly is going to happen, you know, how this is going to be not resolved, but how Israel is going to win in a sense, the Palestinians are going to lose, and that's why I just want to take a minute to talk about where we are. And that is this, you know, that we've always, the two-state solution idea, which is, okay, which is the solution of governments. Governments all support that because they know it's not gonna happen, but it's a good conflict management tool. Deals with it, this is Israel. Israel recognized internationally, a member of the UN, on 78% of historic Palestine. So you had the partition, of course, in 1947. The Jews, who were newcomers to the country, the Zionists, got 56% of Palestine. And the indigenous population, through the UN, that really had no authority to do this, only got 46% of the country. So that Israel was established, and that's why they didn't accept it. But Israel was then on 56%. You had the what we call the War of Independence, of course, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, and Israel conquered half the land that had been allocated to the Palestinians by the UN in the partition plan. So now, after 1948, Israel is on 78% of historic Palestine, and Jordan took the West Bank of the Jordan River, and Jerusalem and Egypt took Gaza. 67 comes, and Israel completes its conquest of Palestine. That was always in the Zionist program. So that today we call the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza occupied territory. In international law, it's seen as an occupied territory. But nevertheless, Israel doesn't see it that way, because what we call the West Bank, and if you look at a map and don't know much about it, the two-state solution looks a little bit reasonable. I mean, here you've got a coherent territory. Okay, and then here maybe we'll make a connection. But it looks like, okay, we can detach a Palestinian piece of territory from Israel, and here you got two states. But what people don't take into account, and Judy referenced, sources that are still relevant politically from 3,000 years ago, biblical sources and others, is that what we call the West Bank is actually Judea and Samaria. From the point of view of the Zionists, who are very different from Jews here, that's a whole other discussion. But Zionism was defined Judaism territorially. It went back to the Bible and defined Jews as people that are living there, indigenous, actually, which is kind of outrageous claim, within particular borders. So that biblical geography becomes the relevant geography of Israel today. Meaning that Judea and Samaria is not a marginal piece of territory to the side where Arabs live that can be detached. It is the heart of the land of Israel. So for settlers, for right-wing Zionists, and actually not, let me even back up on that a little bit. For Zionists in general, because we have to remember that this whole enterprise of Zionism, including the Six-Day War, including the conquest of the West Bank, including the building of settlements, including the building of the wall, the whole thing has been done by the Labour Party, which is the secular, so-called left-wing socialists. So we can't blame this on the Likud, Netanyahu, the religious settlers. This has been done really by the mainstream of the Zionist movement, which really means that Zionism is a settler colonial movement committed to taking over and Judaizing Palestine. So, but the point I'm trying to make then is that rather than accepting the two-state solution, of course, then Israel went to settle and annex and incorporate the West Bank into Israel. It didn't want to do that with Gaza. That's why I say Gaza is marginal. There's 2.5 million people almost in Gaza. It's a marginal land. The groundwater has already been used up. And Israel certainly doesn't want to annex a territory that brings 2.5 million more Arabs into, under Israeli rule. So it wants to cut it out. And in fact, Israel would like to give it away. If not to Egypt again, to some Arab peacekeeping force, to the UN, to somebody. So it's not, I mean, our settlers don't want to settle. But the mainstream of Israeli society and government policy is we want to get rid of Gaza. So we're really talking about the West Bank, which is called Judea and Samaria. We don't use the word West Bank. And that's now been settled. There are 750,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem, which is a part of the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank. 750,000. But not only that, you have a whole network of Israeli-only highways that incorporate the territory into Israel. You've got settlement blocks, these pinkish areas that really envelop and create kind of a grid so that you're completely encompassing the Palestinians inside. Israel controls all the borders, all around. And the Palestinians are then locked into 3 islands. There's an island kind of, you see the brown areas in the north. The gray areas are all controlled by Israel. But all the Palestinian Authority has is what we call Area A and B. A is this little dark area around the major cities. That's 18% of the occupied territories, Area A. In other words, we're talking about 18% of 22% of historic Palestine. Because the occupied territory is 22% and Israel is on 78%. Now you have Area B, which is the darker brown and, well, actually the beige. The darker brown is A, the lighter brown, the beige, is B. B is where half the Palestinian population lives. It's another 22% of the West Bank. So A and B together are 40% of the West Bank. And that's under Palestinian Authority control as well. They control building and the municipalities and so on. And then C, which is all the rest, the settlements plus this gray area, 60% of the West Bank is under full Israeli control. So when we talk about apartheid, and the UN talks about apartheid, and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and almost every group, we were talking about, because this isn't going to be given back. Now, the 2-state solution, of course, you can always call a Bantustan, like in South Africa. You can always call it a state. You remember these Bantustans in South Africa? Remember Transkei, for example. Well, Transkei had a president, had a parliament. You take these Bantustans and you give them the appearance of a state. And that's why the 2-state solution is so good for governments. It's conflict management. Because Israel can expand and expand and expand. And then whatever territory is left over, where you've pushed and confined the Palestinians, that can be called the state. Now you have a 2-state solution, even though these enclaves where Palestinian lives are not sovereign, they're not viable, they have no economy. They're Bantustans, precisely the South Africa sense. That's why we talk about apartheid. So our assumption was, if you look at this last map, without the dots, actually, our assumption was Israeli apartheid, approved by the Canadian government and the American government, of course, and so on, would eventually lead to an Israel on 85% of historic Palestine. In other words, the 78% of Israel plus the settlement blocks. You see, Israel would retain control, of course, over the whole country, but it would allow a little kind of a Palestinian Bantustan to emerge in areas A and B and Gaza, which is about 15%. historic Palestine. Now, we have to remember, by the way, that the Palestinians today are more than half the population of that country. So you're already, before refugees returned, then you have the refugees outside, but inside, the majority population is now being confined to 15% of the land. And that's always been our working assumption of apartheid. Last week, you know, you have this guy, the finance minister of Israel, is called Bezalel Smotrich. Very violent settler. He's been arrested dozens of times, even for terrorism and extremely violent things. Who's the finance minister, but he's also in the Ministry of Defense. He's the one that controls the civil administration, which is the military government of the West Bank. So this violent settler is the authority that has authority over land expropriations, house demolitions. I mean, tens of thousands of Palestinian homes have been demolished, and the building of settlements on Palestine. Now that's in the hands of a violent right-wing settler. Okay, so what he did last week as the head of the civil administration, and this has to be approved by the government, so he's not doing this on his own, is he said, we're taking back Area B from the Palestinian Authority. The 22% of the West Bank where half the Palestinians live, we're nullifying or we're canceling the authority of the Palestinian Authority to control building. Right? Now that's going to be and so that means that in Area B, Israel will begin to demolish Palestinian homes, will begin to expropriate land, and will begin to build settlements. You see, now half that population is now going to be pushed into Area A. Well, Area A is 18% again of 22%. It can't possibly accept that population. So what we're looking at then is a double ethnic cleansing. On the one side, you have Gaza. And Israel doesn't want Gaza, but it certainly wants to get as many Palestinians out of Gaza as possible, you know, for control.
They want the gas, you know, on the sea.
That's right. Well, and then Jared Kushner said, if you remember a few weeks ago, that actually, you know, since Gaza's been leveled and made uninhabitable, once we get the Arabs out, that's his language, a lot of waterside property is now freed up. I mean, this is, you know, a serious thing from a real estate guy that has pretty good relations with what could well be the next president. So in other words, the idea is to get as many Palestinians out. Now they can't drive them out. And this is what we have to really watch for. Humanitarian is often the enemy of the political. What's going to happen is there'll be an international humanitarian thing. I'm sure Canada will lead the way. You know, we'll accept, and matter of fact, Canada already said they're going to do this. I don't know if they've given a number. We will accept 50,000 refugees from Gaza. Well, they're not really refugees. They've been made refugees and the land uninhabitable precisely for that purpose. So now, and actually, I don't want to insult anybody here, so if you're active in this, don't, you know, people have gotten up in my glass the other night in wherever it was, Waterloo or Kitchener. You know, if people got up and said, I'm a part of a movement, this is a family, this is a Gazan family, we're raising money to help this Gazan family get out. Well, on one level, you can understand that, and of course, that's good for them, maybe even crucial for that family. But on a wider basis, especially if this is a movement where everybody's beginning to identify families. It was in Hamilton last night. That's a part of the ethnic cleansing. That's exactly what Israel wants. So for good reasons, good liberal people are actually, a part of the ethnic cleansing. So the United States will say, well, we'll take 50,000. Australia will say, we'll take 100,000. And New Zealand will take some, France will take some, maybe Britain. In other words, if you divide it up and everybody takes a few tens of thousands, you could get 1 million or more Palestinians out of Gaza under the guise of humanitarian. So that's the form that ethnic cleansing is going to take there. On the other hand, you also certainly want to ethnically cleanse the West Bank, because these are actually Arabs that Israel has to directly rule over, under its apartheid regime. So it wants as few Arabs. I'm saying Arabs because we don't use the word Palestinians in Israel. And so that's, you see, if you then take over Area B, and simply Palestinians have nowhere to go. Nowhere, and again, you get almost the same, not the same degree of violence, but the same clearing of the land to make it uninhabitable for Palestinians. Then they'll have to find ways to go through Jordan and out to other countries. And then again, you could easily get the same thing. Canada will say, well, we'll take 10,000 from you. It's the same kind of a mechanism, or they'll emigrate. The point is that you have ethnic cleansing going on from both sides. Now, we had thought that then apartheid would be, again, Israel on 85% of Palestine, and then the Palestinians confined to the 15% of A, B, and Gaza. But what Smotrich declared, when he declared then they were taking Area B away from the Palestinian Authority, then now we're talking about something like this. This is, you see, if you take A and B, that's this yellow, and of course Gaza. But now most of that is gone from the Palestinians. So now we're looking at Israel on more than 90% of the country. More than 90% of historic Palestine, and the Palestinians are confined. You see, this is Area A here. See, Israel controls the whole Jordan Valley, and in fact, yesterday, Israel expropriated 12,000 acres of land right in this area of the Jordan Valley. This has all already been ethnically cleansed, except for this island of Jericho, you see? So that this little area here is where this dot is. Area A is here. You see, this is how the map, it's all disconnected too, because here is A around Salfit, and here is A around Ramallah, but you see in between it's all B. So you see how Israel will further fragment and divide the Palestinians. So that leads you somehow to some little tiny enclave here. Now we go, Jerusalem has taken over the whole central part of the West Bank. So you've got Bethlehem here, that's all surrounded by settlements, and then going down to Hebron. So this is kind of another, but you see here's B again, disconnecting it all. So that's another dot. So basically, and then of course in Gaza, especially if it's uninhabitable, I don't know how it's going to be rebuilt. And then if Israeli settlers begin to move back. So even Gaza won't be repopulated. Whatever Palestinians remain will remain maybe around Rafah in the south, because Khan Yunis, Gaza City, all the other cities and towns of Gaza have been destroyed and aren't going to be rebuilt unless they're rebuilt for settlers by Israel. So in other words, we're talking now about apartheid on 90% of Palestine. Now, this isn't just some scenario. And this is what I want to alert us to. That is that Biden has said, Canada is a part of that whole thing, the whole G7 and the NATO and all of that, that as soon as the fighting dies down in Gaza, we are going to go back to the normalization process that we were in between Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Egypt. You see, If you remember that, it was a normalization, and look what happened. Look what happened, a week before October 7th. Netanyahu, if you remember, gets up in the UN, brandishing a map of the whole country, of all of Greater Israel, right, in the UN. And he said, within a week, we are going to sign a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. What would that mean? That would mean the end of the Palestinians, and it would mean the end of what we call the conflict. So, because Israel would then expand to the Jordan River, you see, it would expand over the entire country. And that would be not legitimized and recognized. It's a part of it. This is a G7 initiative. Canada would do it. So in other words, you're accepting, recognizing, legitimizing the settlement regime, the apartheid regime of Israel. That's normalized. You're really, the Palestinians disappear as any kind of political force. The Palestinians are locked into these little islands, and it's over. There is no more conflict. There are no more negotiations. There is no more peace process because nothing else to talk about. It's done. And then this whole situation is then normalized with the Arab world. So Saudi Arabia is a part of it, the Gulf states, Jordan, the Emirates, Egypt, and so on. So that you've got basically a greater Israel uniting with the bigger Arab world, and the Palestinians disappeared. And that, I think, is partly behind the timing of October 7th. It's very hard to ignore that coincidence that the Palestinians are just on the cusp of being eliminated as a people, as a political factor, and then you have October 7th happen, which stopped normalization in its tracks. But this is the bigger, that's why I'm saying, while we're focused on Gaza, these bigger things are happening that we're not paying attention to. And that is that Biden, Canada, Trudeau, the G7 have not given up on normalization. On the contrary, they want, they need Israel because the United States is desperate to pivot to China. It wants to get out of the Middle East, where it's been messed up all this time. So the plans are afoot to create a Middle East NATO based on the three pillars would be Israel. It's the only state that has the military capacity to, to defend Western hegemony in the Middle East, especially against Iran and China. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. So that's where they're going. In order to get this bigger issue of global hegemony, regional hegemony, that allows the US to lead, you need that kind of an Israel. So we're going back, I think it'll probably be after the Israeli elections. They haven't been said yet, but there are going to be elections. And that will be, let's say, within the next 6 months or so, this is going to happen. So this really should be the issue. It's hard to mobilize people around normalization. It's such a bland word, it's so abstract. Then you have to take a half an hour, like I just have, to explain it. But this is the issue. This is because if normalization goes through, the Palestinians are gone. And that's really facing us. And that's where this whole settler colonial enterprise succeeds. So let me just say that. Now, okay. I'm not gonna, okay. Never mind. We need, now, let's go back and look at this whole, the whole, we have to understand. Now, again, what I'm saying, we have to push back against normalization. But that also doesn't give us a political way out. It prevents maybe the apartheid regime from being accepted and legitimized and so on, but it still isn't a proactive political program for Palestinian liberation and for Palestinian rights and for well, we'll talk about reversing this. So that's why we have to understand what it's all about in order to get to a political program that's relevant. You know, a political program just isn't, you decide, hey, you know, this is what should be, and I'm gonna write down 10 points, and this is the program. It's like going to the doctor. I mean, the diagnosis is super important. You get a pain in your chest. Yeah, I mean, the doctor's got 1,000 medicines he prescribed to you. But is it a stroke or is it am I getting an acid attack? Give me a Tums. I mean, that's kind of an important part of the whole thing. And on the basis of that, the doctor decides what pill he's gonna take off the shelf. Well, if you have a misanalysis of what's happening in Israel and Palestine, that's not gonna lead you to any political a political program is the treatment. But it has to flow out of the diagnosis. You can't have a diagnosis and then, you know, and then have another. In other words, you can't see this as a conflict between two national groups, both of which are legitimate, and then get to a one-state idea. I mean, that leads to two states, right? That's the logic of it. On the other hand, you can't look at it as a settler colonial enterprise and get to two states. Because you understand that the colonial power will always be in control. So we need a paradigm shift. And that is, we have to stop about calling it a conflict. We always, the Israel-Palestine conflict, I mean, even I was stumbling because I don't have a good term necessarily to replace it. We talk about the Israel-Arab conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict, even the Palestinians talk about the conflict. It's not a conflict. A conflict, right, is between two or more sides that get into a fight about something, and there's a conflict. Well, the minute you call the colonial power aside, you're legitimizing. In other words, colonialism, we all know, colonialism is the unilateral invasion of countries to take their resources, to use their cheap labor, to control their part of the world, or to sell it, like in Israel or South Africa, or Algeria or Canada, right? And take it over and replace it. So we cannot legitimize in any way, any kind of colonialism. British colonialism in India or settler colonialism in Palestine or Canada. It can't be legitimized. But the minute you talk about a conflict, you're doing that. You're raising the colonial now to a side. Now there's two sides, right? And you're creating a false symmetry. Because if there's two sides, now they're roughly equal. And that's where we get language we hear all the time. Both sides. How many times have you heard that? Both sides should end the conflict. Both sides should negotiate. Both sides should end the violence. And that puts, you know, the colonized in an impossible position because they're not really in a symmetrical position in terms of power with the colonizers. And how do you resolve a conflict? You know, we all know conflict resolution. You know, you get the sides together. And then you build trust, right? You have a meal together, you have some tea, you go walk in the woods of Camp David, you know, and then you start to negotiate and you end the conflict by compromise. Well, what are we expecting the colonized to compromise on? What are we expecting the Palestinians to, that 78% of the country belongs to somebody else, the colonizers? You know, and in Camp David, when Barak, Ehud Barak, made a generous offer to the Palestinians, right, in which it wasn't 78%. He offered them, you know, pieces of the West Bank and Gaza, and Arafat said no. Clinton got right on TV and blamed Arafat for being intractable.
Yeah.
So if the colonized don't accept the generous terms of the colonizers, they're being blamed. And the colonizers come out as the peace-loving, rational, right, actors. I mean, do we expect the Palestinians to negotiate about refugees? Refugees have a right to return, period, in international law. Well, there's 7 million refugees. Israel's not going to accept them, obviously. So now we begin this kind of, give and take, this kind of, market type stuff. Well, would you take 100,000? And Israel says, well, you know what, maybe we'll take 50,000. Well, what about 65? You begin dealing in human lives. You know, how many refugees have a right to come home? I mean, what right does anybody have, including Palestinians, to do that? You know, in human rights, it's interesting. In human rights law, you have no right to abrogate your own rights. In other words, you can be forced, the Palestinians can be forced by a stronger Israel with the US behind it to sign something. They can be forced to do it, but they have no right themselves to do that because they're forfeiting, they're abrogating their own human rights. So refugees have a right to, that shouldn't be negotiable. You know, the erasure of the Palestinian people, and every aspect, every element of this should not be up for negotiation. So conflict is a bad term. And it feeds exactly into, it justifies, legitimizes the colonial power. So instead, we should be talking, now it's a mouthful, but a diagnosis, that's the point of it, You're happy when you diagnose this because you know what you have. The language is important, even though it might be some fancy medical term. What the disease is, it's not a conflict, it is an anti-colonial struggle. It's an anti-colonial struggle against Zionist settler colonials. That's what the name of the disease is. Now, whatever treatment we find has to flow out of this. That it's an anti-colonial struggle, and we'll talk about that in a second. And there's no negotiated solution, as we've talked about. The only way out of settler colonialism is to decolonize. You don't compromise, you don't negotiate, you decolonize. You dismantle all the structures of domination and control that the Zionist regime, the Zionist settlers have imposed. You dismantle them, and once that control and domination is eliminated, then you go on to forging a new political and social order. You can't form, and you can't reform colonialism. You can't say, well, okay, we'll leave the colonial structures intact, and then we'll create a little Palestinian state. You have to demolish entirely that whole structure in order to get to a new kind of a thing. So I'll do this really quick. So in settler colonialism, then, the settler movement always invents a narrative about why the country belongs to the settlers and not to the indigenous. I don't know if you have a name for your narrative. In the United States, it was manifest destiny. And it was, and usually it has to do with God. Well, God, is always the ultimate real estate dealer. God gave it, right? The South Africa, the Dutch Reformed Church. God gave South Africa to the white man. What Judy was referencing, the doctrine of discovery of the Catholic Church. All of Latin America, good parts of other parts of the world were colonized under the doctrine of discovery. That's why Columbus discovered America. The French didn't like religion, don't like religion. So for them, it was a civilizing mission. That's what they call their colonizing thing. Well, Zionism has a ready-made narrative. Well, we got the Bible. I mean, can't get much more authoritative than that. But it's not the Bible that you're thinking of. It's the first 5 books of Moses and Joshua. Those are the books of conquest, the books of genocide. And if you want to read the clearest definition of genocide that exists, read the book of Joshua. Man, God says, you kill every single man, woman, child, ass, donkey, cow, dog that exists in all of Canaan. You killed it, it was genocide. I mean, genocide with a capital G. God was genocidal. Is genocidal, also in the books of Moses. But, and then you take all the possessions, the loot of the Canaanites, and you sacrifice them to the Lord, right? All right, now I don't know if you've read the book of Joshua, but there's one guy named Achan. Achan took a silver cup, you know, from all the loot, you know, instead of sacrificing God, he kind of, you know, scurried away out of the cup, and God found out. God says to Joshua, burn them. I mean, that's what he said, burn them. And Achan says, geez, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it on you. Burn them. And they burned it. So those are the sources that Zionism is coming out of. That's the narrative, the national narrative, but really genocide. Now, genocide is built into all settlements. I don't want to pick out the Zionists in particular, you know, certainly Canada has its good share of genocide. Every settler colonial movement is genocidal. But here you had not only was it genocidal in its structure and process, but it was genocidal in its narrative, in what it was doing. So when Judy asks, why don't Israelis feel bad about what they're doing to Arabs? It's because, you know, they're not fulfilling God's law. Some of them are. The Zionists that started Zionism were not religious. They were anti-religious. But nevertheless, you know, God was very useful. And the whole narrative that's built in the Declaration of Independence. So it's a legitimate moral movement to reclaim the land of Israel that belonged to us. And Arabs then don't fit in, but they're basically foils, or they're basically disrupting what should be a moral, you know, a historical process of Jews coming back to their country, you know. So that's the way it's seen. So in other words, every settler colonial people, including you and me, I'm a double settler, you know, I'm American and I'm Israeli. And I call myself in my book a settler who refuses, you know, because I don't only acknowledge it like you do, but I'm also trying to end settler kind of a thing. So the settlers invent the narrative, then they invade the country in order to make it their own. And a term we never use, but we should use, is Judaization. It doesn't have a legal reference like occupation or apartheid, but that's putting your finger on what it is. The Zionist movement was intended to Judaize Palestine, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, transform Palestine into Israel. So that this is really the proper term that we should be. That's my man here. I gotta pay him afterwards. So. All right. I'm not going to go into detail, but settler colonialism is inherently violent, of course, because it's displacing, and it's unilateral. So that goes back to another reason why it's not a conflict. I mean, the Palestinians never had a conflict with Jews. Jews had lived in Palestine for millennia. Jews were coming. I wrote a book about the Jewish yishuv in Jerusalem in the 19th century. You know, Jews were coming in fairly large numbers in the 19th century, but they were coming either as immigrants, or they saw themselves kind of as pilgrims, people coming to the land of Israel for religious reasons, and that was fine. There were no conflicts whatsoever, and they were accepted because they were willing to integrate into the wider society. And then, you know, they lived out their own religious lives, cultural lives, and so on. So the whole idea that this is a conflict, you know, is unfair to the Palestinians, because they're irrelevant to this. It's unilateral. It has nothing to do with the Arabs. Arabs are just, their Zionism called them the hidden question. That was the way they dealt with it, but it's unilateral, we just do it, and it's us. It's almost narcissistic, you know, it's all about us. Okay, and then of course, it seeks to eliminate the indigenous population and replace them with the settler population, which means that genocide is built in. So by necessity, the indigenous have to resist. When they have, there's no settler colonialism without resistance from the indigenous. I mean, you don't voluntarily get displaced and dispossessed and thrown out of your homes and lose your country and lose your heritage. I mean, so always is resistance, and it's permanent resistance. Sometimes they can't always sustain military resistance. Sometimes, like in Canada, they're marginalized. There's smaller groups now. They're not going to overthrow the Canadian government, but there's resistance in all kinds of ways. That continues. It can never be ended. Can never be normalized for the indigenous unless you have decolonization. You know, and we're far from that, you know, here as well as there. So they have to resist, and then their resistance is criminalized. That's how, because the settler colonialists can't direct if they recognize the indigenous as a side, they're legitimizing the fact that they exist. So Israel doesn't talk about a conflict, because the conflict means we're in conflict with someone, but that someone doesn't exist for us. Israel has never, ever, until this day, recognized the Palestinians as a people with national rights. They're Arabs. There's a bunch of Arabs running around. That's what they've always been. And therefore, you know, if morally we're coming to make this country Jewish again, and you know, we're replacing the Palestinians or the Arabs or whatever with Jews, which is a good thing, and we're reviving Judea and Samaria, and we're Jerusalem, and you know, all of that, and we're a democratic country. We're a part of the UN. You know, we're best friends with Canada. In that case, anybody attacking us is a criminal. It's not political. How can it be political? We're normal, everyday people, and that's kind of the narrative that comes out of October 7th. You know, here are just innocent people, which they were. I mean, I'm not. My heart goes out, you know, for the hostages and the people that were killed, of course. But when Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, said there's a political context to October 7th, he was vilified by Israel. You know, they wanted his resignation because it's settler colonialism. There is no context. There is no, you know, and so these have to be criminalized. They're terrorists, and that's all. You know, you can never admit that they have something to resist. You see, and that's part of the equation, and you see that in Gaza very well. This, from my point of view, is a symbol of settler colonialism, the bulldozer. You know, because you're destroying the culture, you're destroying the housing, you know, you're erasing the people. This is a D9 bulldozer made by Caterpillar. It's been a bulldozer for many years, but this one now is automated. So it doesn't need, you know, there's no soldiers in there that are in danger. This is called, all right. So look how big it is. First of all, see these people standing by the shovel? You get a sense of how huge and powerful this machine is. Now, the shovel is specially designed, engineered, because these bulldozers are really mining. Use D9 bulldozers in iron ore mines or sometimes in heavy construction, oh, they're more for mining. Powerful big machines. Well, if you hit a building with a normal Caterpillar, the building's gonna collapse on the driveway. So Israeli military engineers, together with Caterpillar engineers, designed the shovel in a way that when it hits a building, it falls away. It can even be a 3-4 story apartment building. You see, and these bulldozers precede the tanks. If you see a column of the Israeli army invading Gaza, it's first, and that's in fact their motto. It doesn't say, you know, always first. They're first because they clear everything. The houses, the roads, bombs in the roads, fields. It just clear this way for the army to come in. Including, for example, when Israel attacked the Khan Yunis hospital and all the hospitals, really. There were thousands of Palestinian refugees from, you know, huddling around the hospitals for safety in tents. Well, these bulldozers ran over the tents, ran over the people. I mean, you're talking about thousands of people that were killed by these bulldozers clearing the way for the army to come in. So this, from my point of view, is the symbol of settler colonialism, the erasure, the destruction total. I mean, you know, again, you can see how people rationalize. Get back to Judy's point a little bit, or how they try to, what's the name of this terrible machine of mass destructive? It's a weapon of mass destruction. It's called the panda. And they call it affectionately the teddy bear. You know? So when it's in the news, and it's been in the news, all these soldiers that are in their lovely teddy bear, and they even have teddy bear, you know, little teddy bears in the cabin sometimes or whatever. You see, it comes out to the general public. It's not such a bad thing. No, it's next slide. We'll come back in 1 second. Pardon me?
Red arrows.
No, those red arrows are how they designed the contour of the shovel so that when it hits the building, it falls away. In other words, what I'm saying here is this isn't spontaneous. It isn't like, you know, we're being attacked and now we're defending. This shovel is intentional. I mean, these are trained engineers that sat in offices and designed and thought. In other words, genocide is planned in detail, and how is it done, with what kind of a machine? And that's, I think, something that really we have. That's why I say it's a symbol, because the intent is there. It isn't simply some weapon that's defended. And here you see exactly that thing. What I said about insecurity, there's always insecurity in a settler colonial place because the wounds are always open. The indigenous are still colonized. You know, the violence is still there. Now, in Israel, of course, the insecurity is more real. I mean, the Palestinians are a large population that have military capabilities, right? So, I mean, there really are attacks. And look, Israel's tried now for 9 months to defeat Hamas without success. So,
It's not the same building.
yeah, I'll come to it 1 second. But the insecurity is more than that. The insecurity comes from the very presence of the indigenous. Because as long as they're there, as long as sometimes you can see them out of the corner of your eye, as long you can't put the closure on settler, you can't normalize because they're there. And the Pandora's box is always poking up, and what, you know, all of a sudden you discover residential schools. All of a sudden you discover, you know, it's always there. And that's what I'm trying to show in this picture. This is the Islamic University in Gaza, before and after.
Oh.
And the Israeli commander, all the universities have been destroyed in Gaza, all the libraries, almost all the mosques. The Israeli commander said, you know, on TV, there was no military justification for destroying this university. It's not, there wasn't tunnels, there weren't Hamas. This was done because it was a symbol of Palestinian life. See, and that's the essence of this set of colonialism. It's destroying you have to erase completely, and only if you can erase completely can you then put the lid on settler colonialism. Okay. And then the only way out, I won't go into all this, but the only way then out, the only way settler colonialism ends for the settlers is through normalization. Once it's normalized, like here to some degree, it can never be completely normalized, like we've said, but, or what Biden and everybody is trying to do in Israel. It's interesting that they took that term, but that's the term that's used for how does it end? You simply normalize. So if you go downtown and you say, I want to buy a ticket to Palestine, good luck. I mean, travel agent will probably say, you mean Pakistan, right? If you want to say, I want to buy a ticket, I'd like to visit the church in Bethlehem, which is not in Israel. Well, okay, well then you buy a ticket to Israel. You see it, and you go from Ben Gurion Airport to Bethlehem. So that's the normalization procedure. Okay, now if that's the disease, you see, then from this analysis, I mean, I know I've taken quite a while, but this is the diagnosis. Now we have to find a solution to this, a political program that treats it, that ends it, that deals with it, right? And that can only be, in my view, one democratic state. Now, the first step, like I said before, is to decolonize. We have to dismantle all the structures of control and domination. I'm not going to get into all that, but the government has to change, obviously. The state has to change. Oh, the whole legal system has to be dismantled, the policies, the procedures. The land has to be retaken and redistributed with the new land regime, because land is the key to settler colonialism. Taking the land, economic management, population management, I won't get into that. Plus the management of legitimacy, which means decolonizing Hasbara, Israeli PR, and reframing and presenting a new kind of a thing. After decolonization, then, there's the idea of one state. Go another slide. And another one. And another one. And another one. Okay. I have to play around. Oh, so our idea politically, once you have decolonization, now there's a new playing field, is pretty straightforward. One democratic state. I mean, that shouldn't be so outrageous to the Canadian government. Replacing a settler colonial ethno state with a democracy. Is that really so outrageous?
Colonial settler state like Canada. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, yeah, but see, you've been able to keep the settler colonial so kind of on low key that you can you see yourself as a liberal democracy. I mean, the world sees you as, with Sweden, it's one of the most liberal democracies of all. All right, so our idea is fairly straightforward. One state, not all kinds of tricks that they're trying to play, because the left-wing Zionists, my good friends, they all know the two-state solution is gone. It never was, because as you can see in settler colonialism, there is no intent ever to let indigenous start a state of their own. We can see why it's not even worth talking about the two states. But still, how do we keep Jewish supremacy? How do we keep our control? How do we de facto keep it going, even though we can't have two states anymore? So there's all kinds of ideas, confederations and federations. and cantonization. There's one plan that we create 34 cantons in this country. And then, of course, some cantons are Jewish, most of them are Jewish, some of them are Arab cantons. And, you know, that's the way we'll, and then we all live in the same country. You say, well, what's gonna prevent a Palestinian with no employment, who lives down here in the Judean desert, to move to Tel Aviv? You know, where there's employment, there's a city, there's housing, there's schooling. Well, you know, each canton will have its own council. So it can decide who comes in and who doesn't. You see, it's all this colonial thing, just in different packaging. No, we're saying one country, period. Just like Canada, say. Well, all right, I'm not gonna go there. Forget it. One country, one citizenship, one parliament, you know, one set of laws. Period. We're all, now, we don't have a name for that country. Because if it's a decolonized country, you're not gonna call it Israel. Palestine. And if you call it Palestine, which is a possibility, it's not inclusive really, because almost half the population aren't Palestinians. So let's just call it, for the sake of our discussion tonight, I'll end in a couple minutes, let's call it Za'atar. You know, you all know what Za'atar is, it's a Palestinian verb. So we're all Za'atarians, right? Living in a state of Za'atar. It's a civil society, we all have the same, we're all Za'atarian citizens. Okay, now, of course, the refugees have a right to return. But here it's interesting because the revolution of this is the idea of citizenship. Today in Israel, everything depends on what your religious or ethnic identity is, who you can marry, where you can live, what job you can get, can you even leave the country? Or some of you will say, you know, the ability to enter the country. Everything depends, you know, you scrap all of that and you go to the idea of a citizenship. So here, the refugees actually have a double right to return. They have a right to return as refugees, like all refugees do, but they're also our citizens. Just because they were driven out in the Nakba, or even if they voluntarily left the war zone, doesn't mean they lost their civil status. You know, if you flee Kyiv, as the Russians are coming to Poland, you don't stop being Ukrainian. So they never stopped being citizens of the country. So in a way, they're coming back to reclaim a citizenship that they never lost. So there's a double right of return here. Of course, you'll have all the individual rights that you have in any democracy. I won't get into that. The hiccup comes. There's always, of course, it's gotta be some problem, right? God forbid, it should be a smooth process. So the problem is, it's not a problem. The disagreement has to do with polygamy. And there's two views. Just to reflect what you were saying before about Palestine, I mean, that's the view of the vast majority of Palestinians, maybe 90% or more, that says, look, decolonization means liberation. It's a Palestine liberation movement. It's, it's a liberation movement. Liberation means liberation. In other words, Palestine becomes Palestine. It's called Palestine. Palestinian national rights of self-determination are restored. Palestinian people come home, and it's Palestine. It's our country. Well, when you say, well, what about the Israeli Jews? I mean, the answer is, in a way, who cares? Why should I care about the colonists that did all this stuff to me? If they want to stay, they can stay as citizens of Palestine, right? They've got equal rights, but the state is a Palestinian state. And if they want to leave, which would be great, they can leave. So that's the idea of, I think, most Palestinians. I belong to a group, the One Democratic State Campaign, that says that's just, it's moral, but it's not gonna work. Because it's based on the idea, which I understand completely, but I don't accept, that Israeli Jews are not a national group. That you can reduce them, I mean, it's after 76 years of sovereignty in the state of Israel and counting and so on, they've become a national. I mean, whether they should be or shouldn't be or what, and Palestinians don't want to accept it. The vast majority of Palestinians will never. They say, and they're right in a way, if we recognize Israeli Jews as a national group like us, we're rewarding settler colonies. We're almost legitimizing, which is true. On the other hand, sociologically, politically speaking, they are. And you can't reduce a national group to an ethnic or a religious group. So we're stuck in a way in a binational reality. You know, and so the problem here is that if you have a state, and you see it's almost a reversal of Israel, Jewish democracy here, a Palestinian democracy there. If you try to, one particular national group tries to rule the country, it's almost, I mean, none of us here, I don't think, are pro-nationalists. I mean, none of us like Orban in Hungary, none of us like nationalism, you know? So, you know, nationalism is repressive. Nationalism represents one group, it claims one group owns the country, and it usually gets into a conflict of the groups. The experience of African states, for example, after independence is terrible. Because all the civil states they tried to create were all dismantled in these civil wars between tribes and religious groups and other nations, and all of them were stronger than the civil state. And it collapsed, and you had all, until today, a lot of, look at Sudan. So that what we're saying is it should be one civil state. In other words, everybody's a citizen, and then the trick is, now you're still Palestinian, of course. Don't, you know, ignore that, or Israeli, but that becomes a cultural issue. In other words, there's a transformation of political nationalism that wants hegemony, that wants to rule, into a cultural nationalism. So you can have your language, you have your literature, you have museums, you have universities, every expression, but within the framework of the civil state. So the last slide, I think, or almost slide, this is a picture of how, kind of a depiction of how it would look. The idea being that this is Zata, right? The circle is Zata. The civil society, the people that simply identify as Zatarians. Now they might say, of course I'm Palestinian. Of course maybe I'm Israeli or I'm Circassian or I'm Armenian or I'm Druze or whatever. I mean, I'm not rejecting by any means my cultural heritage and so on, but like in Canada, I want to be a part of Zata. I want to live with other Zatarians. I want to maybe even marry other Zatarians. I want to work together. I want to send my kids to public school. There's a meaning of Zata, so that would be a smaller group at the beginning, obviously, but I think that would attract the middle class people. We can't just reduce all this to a sectarian thing. Here are Israelis and here are Palestinians. There's all kinds of cross-cutting things. Middle-class Palestinians in high tech, or they have businesses or professors or whatever, have much more in common with middle-class Israelis than they have with a Palestinian farmer. You know, the younger generation in particular, the good thing about the young generation is they move on really quickly. You know, and I was in South Africa a few years ago. You know, there's a whole program of, the old anti-apartheid people, they're about our age, teaching about apartheid to the young people, because they forgot, they've never heard about passport laws. Mandela is some ancient figure in the midst of time somewhere, they have moved on. You know, they have their issues, and we'll get into that, but and so I think this gives a chance of the younger generation to move on. You're not trapped in being Palestinian or being Israeli and all of that. You move on to another life. And then within this, again, Israeli national identity, Palestinian national identity becomes a cultural kind of identity. So that's the idea. And finally, the last slide is gonna get is this is really the choice in front of us today. I mean, whatever kind of one democratic state is going to be, are we going, this is where there's no other choice, it's stark. Either we're gonna have an apartheid regime, which is on the horizon, you know, sponsored, approved by our governments, as we talked about, or we're gonna have one democratic state. We have to resolve